I wanted to chat about multiple oppositions and I guess how to get started with this approach, when you might use the approach, and just some tips, I guess, on how to get your mind around it. I kind of think of it, it's just like minimal pairs therapy, but with a couple extra targets put on. Like that for me is like a real simple way to get my head around the approach. Most of us know minimal pairs and you just contrast, you know, the error sound and the target sound. So like k and t. For me, multiple oppositions is just that. You just have a couple extra different targets that you're targeting and contrasting with the error sound. I think the first step, if you are going to consider this approach, is like, when would you use it? And I usually use it when a child has a phoneme collapse. And by a phoneme collapse, I mean that the child is using like one sound or one phoneme to represent a whole lot of different sounds in their speech system. So usually in my head, they're like the D kid or the the G kid or the H kid. Okay. So what I'll usually do, if I'm doing my articulation test, my single word test, if I find that I'm writing D down a lot of the times, that's usually my first like cue that there could be a phoneme collapse here. And so when I'm analysing that sample and I'm seeing that everything's kind of starting with D, I start to make this little collapse chart like this here. And I write down the, you know, that phoneme that everything's collapsing to, which is like, for example, could be D. This is a common one. And then I'll list all the different sounds that are being represented. I think a tip here is, if you're starting to see this, I would usually probe further at clusters. A lot of single word tests, they might not test all the clusters. So I would usually go through, because I want to know, you know, how many sounds the child is collapsing to. So that's, I guess, my first step, is just to map that out. The second step, and I think is the most important step in the multiple oppositions approach, is target selection. Now, when you're contrasting this D sound, you're going to be picking between 2 to 4 different sounds that you're going to contrast, kind of like that minimal pairs, with the D sound. And so the idea is you want to introduce change into this child's system, because at the moment, if they're just kind of doing D, you know, we know that they can use their voice, and we know that they, you know, they can use that stop sound, but, you know, are they using fricatives? Can they do voiceless? Can they do different, you know, places and manners of articulation? So one of the things I like to use is this chart. It's a free download on my website if you're a newsletter subscriber. And I start to plot out what the child's error sounds are, or I'll just like circle, you know, these on here. I'll circle these sounds here, and it kind of shows me what the child doesn't have. You can see here that it's broken up in terms of place, manner and voicing, and then you've got your obstruent and your sonorant there. I know it doesn't have clusters on here, I kind of tackle that later. And so then what my goal is for target selection is I want to choose targets that are different from D. So I don't just want to choose alveolar sounds, and I don't just want to choose voiced stops. I want to make sure that I have different places of articulation, and that I have different voicing and different manners of articulation. So I kind of use this sheet, and I'll use like a whiteboard marker, and I'll start circling maybe possibilities, like, okay, if I've got my D, could I have like maybe, you know, a ch, you know, could that be good? I also think about it, if I get ch, what sounds can I get for free? I might actually be able to get T and SH for free, because the ch sound is made up of those two sounds. So I'm always looking at this and going to this and thinking, what can I get for free? And I might knock off, or I might tick, yep, I could potentially get T and SH for free if I target CH. So I'm kind of using this, and I'm kind of working through in my head what I can do. My preference, and there is no rule for this, this is just something I kind of do, I usually pick an affricate, and I usually would pick a cluster, because it can make so many changes. And then I usually pick a sound that is quite easy, or that I know that the child is stimulable for as well. That's just my personal preference. I think this approach can be a little bit you know, different for some kids, but if there's something they get success in, if there's something they're working towards, that's just kind of what I do, but that's just me. You don't have to. This is your target selection and you have to figure out what your child is doing. So that's kind of my first step. I'll then go through and I'll start just thinking about, you know, what are their later developing sounds? Can I do non-stimulable sounds? And I just kind of think about all those different areas. And then, I'll end up coming up with my final grand plan of what my targets will be. So use these together, and I guess that is the first step that I would do. The second step is, once you've got them, you need to start using that approach. And I might do another video later on, I guess, what my first session looks like when I'm doing multiple oppositions.